On July 1st, 1944, while American soldiers were dying on the beaches of Normandy, 730 delegates in suits gathered at a luxury resort hotel in rural New Hampshire. Over the next 22 days, these men would design a financial architecture that would control more wealth than all the gold ever mined in human history. What they created wasn't just a plan to rebuild war-torn economies. It was the greatest transfer of financial power in recorded history, executed in plain sight while the world's attention focused on the battlefield. The Bretton Woods Conference gave birth to a system so ingeniously structured that 80 years later, every economic crisis, every trade deal, every sovereign debt negotiation still operates within the framework these 730 delegates constructed in those 3 weeks. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single conference in 1944 engineered permanent American economic dominance and why the system they built might finally be reaching its breaking point. The story begins with devastation on a scale that's difficult to comprehend today. By 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Industrial production had collapsed to 30% of pre-war levels, 50 million people were dead, and entire cities had been reduced to rubble. The British Empire, once the world's financial superpower, was effectively bankrupt, having liquidated most of its overseas assets to finance 6 years of total war. But devastation in one place creates opportunity in another. While European factories smoldered and currencies collapsed, the United States emerged from the war holding an economic hand that had never been dealt before in human history. By 1947, America controlled 70% of the world's monetary gold reserves, some $24.8 billion worth. The U.S. industrial base had actually grown during the war, accounting for nearly half of global manufacturing output. This created what economists call a power vacuum, the moment when the old order has collapsed but the new order hasn't yet been established. Great Britain could no longer enforce the gold sterling standard that had governed international finance since 1815. The European colonial powers that had dominated global trade for centuries were now dependent on American food shipments to prevent mass starvation. Into this vacuum stepped two men with competing visions, British economist John Maynard Keynes and U.S. Treasury official Harry Dexter White. Their battle would determine not just how Europe recovered, but who would control the architecture of global finance for the next century. Keynes envisioned an international clearing union with a new global currency called the Bancor that would prevent any single nation from dominating the system. White had a different idea, one that would cement American financial supremacy while appearing to offer international cooperation. The stage was set for what would become the most consequential economic conference in modern history. What happened at Bretton Woods wasn't just about helping Europe rebuild, it was about redesigning the entire structure of global capitalism with America as the architect, the landlord, and the ultimate beneficiary. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, seemed an unlikely venue for empire building. But when 730 delegates from 44 allied nations arrived on July 1st, 1944, they knew they were attending something unprecedented. U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. opened the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference with a warning. Without a new international monetary system, the post-war world risked descending into the same economic chaos that had spawned the Great Depression and World War II. Behind the formal rhetoric, a power struggle was already underway. John Maynard Keynes, representing a financially exhausted Britain, proposed his Bancor plan, essentially a global central bank that would issue a new reserve currency independent of any single nation's economy. It was an elegant solution designed to prevent the very scenario now unfolding, total American monetary dominance. Harry Dexter White, the chief American negotiator, had other plans. White's proposal placed the U.S. dollar at the center of the new system, backed by America's massive gold reserves. Under his framework, all currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone would remain convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. The negotiations revealed the brutal mathematics of power. Britain needed American loans desperately. The war had cost the empire roughly $28 billion, depleting foreign reserves and leaving the country dependent on U.S. credit. Keynes could argue for his banker all he wanted, but White controlled the only functioning industrial economy left standing. As one British delegate privately noted, "We went to Bretton Woods as debtors, and debtors do not dictate terms." Over 22 days of intense negotiation, White systematically outmaneuvered his opponents. The conference split into 3 main commissions, and White-insured Americans chaired 2 of them. When Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov sent a delegation demanding that the Soviet Union receive a voting share equal to America's, White simply replied that voting power would be determined by financial contribution. The Soviets, unwilling to accept subordinate status, would later refuse to ratify the agreements. The final framework established 2 new institutions that would reshape global finance. The International Monetary Fund would monitor exchange rates and provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments crises. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, would provide long-term capital for rebuilding devastated economies. But the genius of White's design lay in the voting structure. Voting power in both institutions was tied to each nation's financial quota, essentially how much capital they contributed. The United States, with the largest economy and gold reserves, was assigned an initial quota of 31%, giving it effective veto power over any major decision requiring a supermajority vote. Even after multiple quota reviews over subsequent decades, the U.S. still maintains roughly 17% of IMF votes, enough to block any fundamental reform to this day. The Bretton Woods Agreement was signed on July 20, 1944. 44 nations agreed to fix their exchange rates to the dollar, maintain those rates within a 1% band, and allow the dollar alone to remain convertible to gold. What this meant in practice was breathtaking. Any country wanting to conduct international trade would need to acquire and hold U.S. dollars as reserves. Implementation began in December 1945. The IMF and World Bank formally came into existence with combined initial capital of $17.6 billion, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $280 billion in 2025 dollars. The United States contributed $175 billion to the IMF alone, cementing its position as the system's foundation and ultimate guarantor. But Bretton Woods was just the opening move. By 1947, it became clear that Europe's economic collapse was worse than anticipated. Industrial production remained at Depression-era levels. Currencies were unstable. Communist parties were gaining ground in France and Italy, exploiting economic desperation. On June 5, 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall delivered a commencement address at Harvard University that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the post-war order. Marshall proposed a massive aid program for European recovery, warning that the consequences to the economy of the United States should be apparent to all. It was a masterpiece of strategic framing, presenting American self-interest as humanitarian necessity. The Economic Cooperation Act of 1948, signed by President Harry Truman on April 3, 1948, authorized what became known as the Marshall Plan. Over the next 4 years, the United States transferred $13.3 billion to 16 Western European nations, equivalent to approximately $150 billion in 2025 dollars. To understand the scale, this represented roughly 5% of U.S. GDP in 1948, deployed in just 4 years. The distribution reveals the strategic priorities. The United Kingdom received $3.2 billion, the largest share at 26% of the total. France received $2.7 billion. Italy got $1.5 billion, and the Western occupation zones of Germany received $1.4 billion. Notably, the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries under Soviet influence rejected participation, deepening the Cold War divide. But here's what most histories miss about the Marshall Plan. The aid wasn't charity, and it wasn't just about stopping communism. Every dollar of Marshall Plan aid had to be spent purchasing American goods and services. European countries received credits, but those credits could only be used to buy American steel, American machinery, American agricultural products. It was the most sophisticated form of vendor financing ever devised. The United States was simultaneously rebuilding Europe and creating permanent export markets for American industry. The architecture constructed at Bretton Woods and reinforced by the Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe. It created a self-perpetuating system of American financial dominance that persists today. By 1952, Western European industrial production had surged 35% above pre-war levels, and U.S. exports to Europe had tripled. American companies had established subsidiary operations across the recovering continent, locking in market share that persists generations later. When the original Bretton Woods system collapsed in August 1971, President Richard Nixon unilaterally ended dollar-gold convertibility on August 15th. Many predicted the end of dollar dominance. Instead, the system evolved into something even more powerful. Within 3 years, the petrodollar system emerged. Following Nixon's closure of the gold window, U.S. Treasury officials negotiated agreements with Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations to price oil exclusively in dollars. The June 1974 agreement with Saudi Arabia created artificial demand for dollars, far beyond what gold convertibility had provided. Think about what this meant. Every country needing to import oil, which meant virtually every industrialized economy, had to hold massive dollar reserves. Oil exporting nations accumulated dollars, which they recycled by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds, effectively financing American government spending. This petrodollar recycling system provided the United States with what economists call an exorbitant privilege and the ability to run permanent trade deficits without the currency collapses that plague other nations. The institutions created in 1944 have grown into global financial behemoths. The IMF today manages a lending capacity exceeding $1 trillion, while the World Bank Group has an asset portfolio of over $400 billion. Both institutions remain headquartered in Washington, D.C., with Americans maintaining veto power over major decisions through the supermajority voting requirements embedded in their original charters. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves currently stands at approximately 58%, down from its peak of 85% in 1977, but still more than triple the share of the euro, its nearest competitor at 20%. More tellingly, 88% of all foreign exchange transactions globally involve the dollar on one side of the trade. Global trade invoicing tells the same story. Roughly 40% of all international trade is invoiced in dollars, even when neither party to the transaction is American. This creates what economists call network effects. The more countries use dollars, the more necessary it becomes for others to do the same. Banks around the world maintain correspondent relationships with American financial institutions to facilitate dollar transactions. International commodity markets, from oil to coffee to copper, price their products in dollars. Even China, America's primary geopolitical rival, holds over $800 billion in U.S. Treasury securities. The hidden architecture reveals itself most clearly during financial crises. During the 2008 global financial crisis, the Federal Reserve became the lender of last resort, not just for American banks, but for the entire global financial system. The Fed established currency swap lines with 14 central banks, providing unlimited dollar liquidity to prevent a complete collapse of global finance. This happened again during the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, when the Fed expanded these swap lines to prevent dollar funding markets from seizing up. What this demonstrates is that the system designed at Bretton Woods has evolved but not fundamentally changed. The US dollar remains the foundation of global finance. America's institutions set the rules, and periodic crises reinforce rather than diminish this dominance. When the world's financial plumbing breaks, everyone calls Washington. But there's a less visible cost to this system, one that's becoming increasingly apparent. The privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency has enabled the United States to accumulate national debt that would trigger sovereign default in any other country. As of 2025, U.S. federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, roughly 125% of GDP. In most nations, debt at these levels would spark capital flight and currency collapse. For America, it barely registers as a constraint because global demand for Treasury securities remains insatiable. This brings us to the uncomfortable question the architects of Bretton Woods never had to answer. What happens when the foundation starts cracking? Since 2000, the dollar's share of global reserves has declined 27 percentage points. Central banks in China, Russia, and increasingly in emerging markets have been diversifying away from dollar reserves, accumulating gold and alternative currencies. China has established currency swap agreements with 40 countries, creating parallel payment systems designed to bypass dollar clearing networks. The weaponization of dollar dominance through financial sanctions has accelerated this trend. When the United States froze Russian central bank reserves and expelled Russian banks from the SWIFT payment messaging system in 2022, it demonstrated both the power and the vulnerability of the dollar system. Every country watching understood the message. Dollar dependence is a strategic liability that can be weaponized against you. The question isn't whether the Bretton Woods legacy will endure forever. History suggests no monetary system does. The question is what replaces it and how chaotic that transition becomes. Several stress indicators suggest the current architecture is approaching a critical inflection point. First, the fundamental economics have shifted dramatically. In 1945, the United States accounted for roughly 50% of global GDP. Today, that figure is approximately 25%, while China alone represents about 18%. The mathematical foundation that made dollar dominance inevitable, overwhelming American economic superiority, has been eroded by 3 generations of global development. Second, the technology of money itself is evolving in ways that bypass traditional dollar infrastructure. China's digital yuan is already being used in cross-border transactions with 26 countries. Central bank digital currencies are in development or active testing in over 130 countries. These systems create the possibility of direct currency exchanges without dollar intermediation, something that was technically impossible when Bretton Woods was designed. Third, the fiscal arithmetic is becoming unsustainable. The U.S. government now pays over $1 trillion annually just in interest on its national debt. The only reason this remains manageable is the artificially low borrowing costs that reserve currency status provides. But interest rates have risen significantly since 2022, and there's a mathematical limit to how much debt can be accumulated before even America faces a reckoning. 3 scenarios emerge when we project these trends forward. Scenario 1 is the managed transition, a new Bretton Woods-style conference where major powers negotiate a multipolar reserve currency system. Perhaps the IMF's special drawing rights, a basket of major currencies, become the new global reserve. This would preserve international cooperation while reducing American unilateral power. Historical precedent offers some hope. The transition from the pound sterling to the dollar as dominant reserve currency occurred relatively smoothly over several decades in the mid-20th century. Scenario 2 is crisis-driven reset, a major financial shock, perhaps a U.S. debt crisis, a derivatives market collapse, or geopolitical conflict that fragments global finance, forces an abrupt restructuring. This would likely involve significant wealth destruction, sovereign defaults, and a chaotic period where no single currency provides the stability that the dollar currently offers. Think of this as the 2008 financial crisis multiplied by the 1930s currency wars. Scenario 3 is gradual erosion. The dollar remains the largest reserve currency but loses its overwhelming dominance. We end up with a multipolar currency system where the dollar, euro, yuan, and perhaps digital alternatives each serve portions of global trade. This scenario is actually already underway and might represent the most likely path forward. For the average person, these shifts matter enormously. Dollar strength affects the price of everything imported: electronics, clothing, coffee, oil. Americans have enjoyed cheaper imports for generations because of dollar dominance. That privilege comes at a cost. Domestic manufacturing has declined. Rust Belt cities have hollowed out, and entire regions have suffered as capital flowed to wherever labor was cheapest. The historical pattern suggests that whoever controls the next iteration of global finance will enjoy similar advantages to what America extracted from Bretton Woods. China's Belt and Road Initiative, lending over $1 trillion to 150 countries, looks suspiciously like the Marshall Plan with Chinese characteristics, using capital deployment to build economic dependency and political influence. Here's what most people fundamentally misunderstand about Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan. They weren't acts of generosity or even particularly clever economic policy. They were the most sophisticated exercise of power projection in modern history, disguised as international cooperation. The genius of what Harry Dexter White and his colleagues designed was creating a system that appeared multilateral while being fundamentally unilateral. 44 nations signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, but only one nation held veto power over the institutions it created. 16 nations received Marshall Plan aid, but every dollar had to be spent buying American products. The system offered participation, not partnership, and that distinction explains why it has endured for 8 decades. 3 lessons emerge from this history that apply directly to the present moment. First, global financial architecture isn't neutral infrastructure. It's the most powerful projection of national interest that exists. The rules of international finance determine who can borrow, who must save, whose debts get forgiven, and whose populations endure austerity. Control those rules, and you control far more than any military alliance could ever achieve. Second, these systems always bear the interests of their architects. The IMF and World Bank weren't designed to optimize global welfare. They were designed to stabilize a world order with America at its center. That doesn't make them evil, but it does explain why their policy prescriptions consistently favor creditors over debtors and capital mobility over labor protections. Third, no system lasts forever, but legacy advantages persist far beyond the system's expiration. Britain lost reserve currency status nearly a century ago, but the City of London remains a global financial center. When dollar dominance eventually fades, American financial institutions, American universities, and American technology platforms will still exercise enormous influence, just as British common law, the English language, and Oxford and Cambridge still shape global systems long after the British Empire's collapse. We're living in the twilight of the Bretton Woods Order, watching the slow-motion transformation of the system those 730 delegates designed in 1944. The dollar will likely remain important for decades to come, but its monopoly is ending. Understanding this history isn't just academic. It's the key to anticipating the economic disruptions ahead and recognizing who's positioning themselves to write the rules for the next era. That conference in a New Hampshire resort hotel didn't just rebuild Europe after war. It constructed a financial empire that shaped the modern world. And like all empires, it's discovering that dominance is temporary, but the competition for succession is eternal. How the petrodollar deal of 1974 gave America a second monetary empire, or China's digital yuan, the silent assault on dollar dominance,